I believe learning is satisfying, and expanding my knowledge on random topics to flex my brain grooves on my friends is always fun. But that also begs the question, what is good education? I was loosely aware of this book. I took a Radical America class as my freshman seminar, so I have heard of Freire, although it had been over a year since then. Chapter 1 generally talks about the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressor. One of Freire's main points is that ultimately the responsibility of the oppressed is to end the cycle of oppression. On page 66, he mentions that people who lack the ability to engage in proper dialogue and reflection only perpetuate rhetoric that continues this cycle, but we are rarely taught how to engage in that kind of dialogue. This leads to the main point of his second chapter on what he calls the banking method of education. This is the standard model of education, where teachers dump information and students absorb it. This is basically what I grew up with for most of my school career, especially as someone interested in the sciences. The scientific field, in my opinion, lends itself to this type of model as much of the information can be seen as objective, but literature should not be like this. Maybe I'm just bitter since I was never the best at English, but I have always found presenting ideas in a piece of literature as objective to be wrong. On page 73, Freire mentions that the banking method places students in a passive role until they accept the role given to them. This passivity stifles creativity, prevents critical thinking, and ultimately discourages students from asking questions. Of course, not all of my schooling has been like that, only about 90%, so it's not that bad. During my senior year of high school, I took a semester class called Reading to Write, and that class opened my eyes to the value of open dialogue. My teacher for the class, Mr. Raymond, would always question everything we said. Whether he believed his points or not, he always wanted us to think critically about our own beliefs. I believe what I learned in that class relates to what Freire wrote. Quote, "Yet only through communication can human life hold meaning." And simple dialogues had me questioning what I believe. After reading Freire, this piece felt much easier to read, and it also felt more personal. One part that stood out to me early on was when Muhammad compared knowledge to a feast. When thinking about oppression and the pedagogy of the oppressed, oppressed populations are essentially starved of knowledge. As a result, when Muhammad discusses black literary societies, she presents them as spaces that satisfy that hunger for knowledge that is not always accessible to marginalized groups. For me, that sort of hunger has always materialized in animal biology. It is what I find most interesting, but others may want to learn about the history of the world or the trials of their cultural group. But many of Muhammad's later points are even more personal for me. Muhammad talks about how non-white students often fail to reach their potential because they lack self-representation in education. This is something I've always felt deeply, even beyond school. As an Arab person, I feel that we have little to no representation in education in America. Of course, American history is incredibly dominated by a white population, but even within that context, it feels like Arabs have no role in the historical narrative. Why didn't we learn about the Turks? Why didn't we expand on the role 9/11 played in shaping prejudice against Arabs? Why didn't we learn more about the War on Terror or Afghanistan? Even while saying this, I do believe I received a more complete education than many others. In history classes, I learned about the consequences of westward expansion for Native American populations. I learned about the Sand Creek Massacre. I learned about the struggles faced by newly freed slaves after emancipation. I read Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois. One of my favorite books is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. But there could always be more. That is what makes Muhammad's main point so convincing. We must educate each other rather than relying entirely on schools. We all have different interests, interpretations, and experiences. One of my coworkers is a junior bio major who plans to take the MCAT. By almost every metric of biological knowledge, she is more experienced than I am. However, she is currently taking an animal science class, and she has asked me for help because I know more about animal biology specifically. Similarly, I have a friend who did not do very well in high school, but I can never figure out electrical wiring without his help. And finally, to Muhammad's point, I've learned more about my own culture by talking to people who grew up in more diverse communities since coming to college than I ever did back home. But first, a word from our sponsor. Breaking out of your chains. Feel the light of day hit your soul for the first time. Yeah, that's what it's like to drive a Ford F-150. For me, The Trial and Death of Socrates is probably the most entertaining thing we've read so far. Especially part 1, where it just feels like Socrates is making fun of Euthyphro. Besides that, what I enjoy about this text is it not only makes me question what I learned, but also the structure of society as a whole. In the dialogue, Euthyphro explains to Socrates that if all gods hate something, it is a crime, and if all gods love something, it is holy or just. Socrates then asks, do the gods love holiness because it is holy, or is it holy because the gods love it? Which is a very interesting question, since the Greek gods had some interesting tastes. I love this question because it challenges what we are taught outside of school, the idea of what is right and wrong. Are our laws made to create justice for people, or is justice simply something people invented to justify the laws they created? These kinds of assumptions allow systems of oppression to continue. When morality is treated as black and white, it becomes easier to justify harm. Historically, this has often been a justification for war. They are bad people because of who they are, so we are justified in attacking them. If a dominant population believes that, oppression becomes easy. To me, this point becomes even clearer when Socrates mentions that many of his students come from noble families. When I reflect on my own education, despite the complaints I've made, I realize that I've received a far more diverse and well-funded education than many people. I grew up in a wealthy, predominantly white town in Massachusetts. The amount of money spent on my education was significantly higher than someone might receive in a different state or district. Simply by being born and raised here, I had a higher chance of receiving a quality education. This shows how closely money and education are tied together. When marginalized groups lack resources, their opportunities are limited. That is how a single class can dominate society for so long, and how oppressive systems can form. If a government wants to maintain control, one effective strategy is to keep its citizens poor and uneducated. This leads to the final point. Socrates was prosecuted for questioning these systems, and despite being sentenced to death, he still refused to escape, because that would only do more harm to society. His life, despite what his prosecutor said, was to the people of Athens, and thus his death would do more to help people than his escape. And most importantly, if a person is prosecuted for simply questioning the rules of society, then maybe the rules are not fair for all. Overall, when reading these 3 pieces, I found myself reflecting on my experiences in school and my current beliefs. They made me think, they made me discuss ideas, and ultimately they helped me learn. And that, to me, is the most important part of education.